Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Global Town Hall 2025, The Future We Need. We are now 6 hours in, and so we have reached the halfway point of today's conference. 4 more sessions await, so if you can, we invite you to please stay with us until the end. Throughout the program, QR codes will appear on your screens. We encourage you to scan these codes to take action and be part of global solutions, whether by signing petitions, supporting several of the programs that Global Citizen is spearheading, or learning more about the issues discussed today at the Global Town Hall. Throughout the rest of the day, feel free to share your moments with us from this event by mentioning at FPC Indo, at GLBLCTZN, and at Global Town Hall on your social media posts. We will now begin Session 5, SOS World Leaders. Can we refocus, realign, and reprioritize world affairs for sustainable development? Please welcome the moderator, Michael Vatikiotis, Senior Advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue.
Selamat pagi. Good morning and good afternoon in London. I'm Michael Vatikiotis. I'm the moderator of this session. As was mentioned, I'm a senior advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. In this session today, we'll look at how a decade ago, world leaders gathered at the United Nations and made a historic pledge. A pledge to leave no one behind and to transform our world by 2030. We are now at 2025, and with only 5 years remaining, progress towards that vision remains far behind expectations. We see escalating conflicts, geopolitical rivalries, trade wars, and overlapping humanitarian crises that have diverted attention and weakened the collective momentum and resolve behind the Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known for short as the SDGs. The very platform these were incubated in is also under threat, the United Nations, in terms of funding and in terms of relevance. SDG financing is on shaky ground. The UN estimates that more than $5 trillion a year will be needed to achieve the SDGs targets by 2030, which cannot all come from governments. Heavy reliance on a few big donors makes progress vulnerable, as shown by the suspension this year of USAID's demographic and health surveys, which disrupted data for 39 indicators of the SDGs in health, gender, and nutrition. Other programs that address human security are also under threat as funding dries up and the political will shrinks. This year's conference on environmental change, the COP, barely got any coverage at all. And today, in this session, we will ask how the world can reprioritize its commitments to sustainable development in the face of these intensifying global challenges. The discussion will highlight urgent imperatives, eradicating poverty, strengthening inclusive governance, accelerating the energy transition, and building resilience, while ensuring that the most vulnerable and marginalized remain at the center of the development agenda. For in the end, the SDGs must not be seen as an afterthought, nor must they be abandoned, for they are a common project that protects and unites humanity. So today we have an excellent panel of speakers and a group of discussants. I'll just briefly introduce the speakers. Dima Al-Khatib is the director of the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation. She's coming to us from New York. Dr. Obiageli Eskewasili is founder and president of Human Capital Africa and is in Abuja in Nigeria. And then last but not least, Gita Wirwan. Gita Wirwan is the author of What It Takes, Southeast Asia, a journey in bringing Southeast Asia to the core of global consciousness. So I want to start, Gita, with you, if I may. According to, one of the major problems in terms of spending on SDGs is the rapid increase in military spending, which is diverting spending from other things. According to SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute of Peace, global military spending reached $2.7 trillion last year. So as these defense budgets soar and everyone's being forced to spend more on defense, the SDG targets with the funding gap for SDGs is growing and growing. What do you think has triggered this, if you like, misplacement of priorities, this higher spending on defense, which outweighs now the spending on sustainable development. Pakita, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. I want to just thank the organizing committee for putting me on this great panel with people I have a lot of respect for. I think there are two major observations in my view, which might explain what you alluded to just now. The first is how the world has gotten into this habit of being comfortable with equating algorithmic amplification with democracy. And this, I think, has driven a widening wedge between public opinion and policy making, as manifested in not just the developed economies, but also developing and underdeveloped economies, where we seem to have a widening gap or wedge, call it divorce between policy and public opinion, and the ability of certain groups to just be able to continue co-opting the way we're supposed to be democratizing. Now, I think at a more structural level, this could be explained by rising inequalities as they relate to whether it's wealth, income, opportunities, or even rising centripetalism as manifested in economic growth of primary cities at a much higher rate than that of secondary cities, much less little towns and villages. And this is not uniquely in a certain type of economies, but it's quite pervasively within the developed, developing, and underdeveloped. So that's the first, I think, observation, which could explain why there might have been a misallocation of resource for sustainable development goals purposes. The second, I can be a bit more specific as it relates to energy transition, which I think hasn't had the kind of realism that it needs to have from a narrative standpoint, much less execution standpoint. We, I think, do not recognize the gap or the huge gap between the affordability for most parts of humanity, call it the global south, which represents about 84% of humanity from a population and collective GDP standpoint, at about 5 cents per kilowatt, whereas most of the renewable energies, can only be procured at a cost at a minimum of around 15 cents. Until today, I think it's not happening to the scale and speed that we would have hoped for, not because of lack of technological capital, but it's mainly because of the lack of economic capital or lack of money or lack of economics. Now, it's a bit of a mockery in the sense that, we're witnessing the accumulation of massive liquidity around the world, particularly in the West, in the context of more than $140 trillion worth of M2 or money supply or liquidity that's not being diversified out, even on the back of rising risk premiums in many developed economies because of two structural reasons. The first one is really the lack of rule of law in most parts of the world that hasn't been able to allow for economic capital allocation to happen in a much more robust manner. And the second is what I think relates to the difference between uncertainties and risks. Uncertainties are unknown unknowns, whereas risks are actually known unknowns, things that can be quantified, priced, measured, and predicted. And unfortunately, most parts of the the global south or the developing economies do not have the ability to translate from uncertainties to risk to the extent that they're not able to attract the necessary capital formation so that they can usher this energy transition narrative, which should have been done in a much more robust manner. I do believe going forward, I think the recognition and implementation of policies which could lead up to a much better or more robust rule of law will help in capital formation. And secondarily, of course, the investment in STEM, which will allow the citizenry to translate better from uncertainties to risks, will allow for much more robust economic capital allocation that will help us in ushering the narrative of sustainability.
Thank you, Pagita. Dr. Obi, what's your view on this? transition away from spending on the SDGs towards spending in other less development oriented areas? You have to unmute. You're on mute, Dr. Obi.
Yes, thank you so very much. Gita, what a pleasure to see you across the across the seas. Gita
Likewise,
was my
Obi.
classmate. Okay, so thank you so much, Michael, and hello to the speakers and co-panelists. I think that my number one point really builds on substantially a lot of what Gita was saying. And my number one point is that the trigger was that the citizens of the world looked away from their democracies, simply just looked away. And so it was very easy for the market and politics to enter into an incestuous relationship, literally, that has produced the kind of outcome that we see today. And so the vanishing space of citizens' engagement in democracy allowed the capture of democracies by the market and the politicians. So that's important to note, because we are in a global town hall of citizens, and it's important that citizens should take accountability for what we see today. And when I say citizens, I don't entirely, apportion the blames to the ones with political illiteracy. I am talking about the enlightened middle class of our societies that simply voted away from being the ones with the requisite knowledge to engage democracies and to ensure that the purpose of government is served. That's my number one point. My second point on the question that you asked is that when you think of a world where guns are chosen over people, where you have 2.7 or whatever that figure you quoted, the CIPRI figure of 2.7 trillion, highest recorded in history, comparing to a 4 trillion financing gap for the SDGs. And yet, every time that there's been a summit, the same leaders gather and make vacuous commitments to the matters of the SDGs. How is that possible? It is possible because most of the spenders are actually the ones that populate the Security Council. And so, in a world where we're facing reality and being guided by data, if most of the spending that has escalated the defense budgets being done by mostly the countries that control the levers of decision making, we shouldn't be surprised. Misaligned incentives for the world is okay for those who are at the top of decision making. So we need to look at the highest military budgets that dominate the UN Security Council and G20, and how that is shaping our global priorities. Number three is that the world treats development as though it were charity, and yet development isn't charity. The development is important as a collective investment for a stable world, and we need a different mindset about development. What you say, data bears evidence that the more that we got growth, spreading across the world, the more stable the world became. And yet, we're going in the other direction now, simply because.
Dr. Obi, can I just come in with another question there? Because on that question of development spending, I feel it very much in the region that I live in Southeast Asia. The disappearance of some of the key global spenders on development, USAID programs have been completely collapsed by the United States. And we see other major countries in the North also reprioritizing their development spending. Where do you think the new sources financing would come for development?
It's a very important question that you've asked, and we've been thinking about this very much on the continent. One of the issues that matter to me is the build-up of human development. There's no pathway to lifting people out of poverty other than what we know. We have to invest in the people. And that means that health and education and associated or ancillary investments are important. And so one of the areas that I've focused on is on addressing this problem of learning poverty, the learning crisis, where 9 out of every 10 children on my continent are not achieving basic literacy and numeracy skills, not to talk of socio-emotional ones. Across the world, it is 7 out of every 10. Now, that's a disaster because foundational learning is a predictor of what would happen in terms of future learning and building up the skills to engage economy. What we first identified is that don't cry about this because it's the reality. Because it is the reality, what must we immediately think of? We need to think innovatively of how to begin to take ownership of development. So number one answer is better ownership of development. All development is local. We cannot abdicate responsibility at country level for development. And so the first thing was get the governments to take another look at what they are prioritizing. We're talking about global priorities. We should start with local priorities. If you've got a capture of the public budget by just a bunch of politicians, what do you think would happen? They would allocate to the things that matter to them. So we've got to engage public budgets and ensure that public budgets are doing better for citizens. That's one. Number two is that we started building coalition around this agenda through Africa CEOs Coalition, meaning all of you people running the best of companies and showing bottom lines, you got to enter the development space now differently. We started bringing in the African philanthropies, and we said to them, you know what, this space is being withdrawn from. You've got to step in and step up and do better. And then we began to talk about the necessity for understanding partnership as a currency. Partnership becomes a currency that is much more critical for development than we used to say it as. So that concept of leverage of what each sector can do better squeezes out much more results for us. And number four is the matter of knowledge. The fact is that we are in a world where we're even much more knowledgeable about how to solve problems. But then, if we're not asking the right questions of problems, it's more difficult to solve them. I think it was Plato or was it Einstein that said, if you give me a problem and you tell me that I have 60 minutes to solve it, I've got to use 55 of those minutes asking the right questions. We're not probing sufficiently in terms of solving problems. And so we're basically saying that even with all the tools that we have, the things that technology gives us, the algorithmic opportunities that we have, we are not engaging the citizens at the center of the development quagmire in the way that enables them to have the agency to solve part of their problems. And my final point is that we know the markets can work for the poor. We just don't need markets that are rigged by those with power. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Obi. And this question then turns us to the question of frameworks. We've talked about spending priorities. We've talked about the role of the private sector to sort of fill some of the gaps. But in terms of managing all this, of course, there's the multilateral institutions, which currently in today's world are considered to be remarkably weak and losing influence. So I'd like to put this question to Dima at the United Nations. Given the shifting power dynamics and shifting spending priorities, how can the multilateral institutions adapt and better coordinate these global efforts to ensure that the SDGs remain a firm commitment and no countries left behind? Dima.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very pleased to join this esteemed panel and this very important and timely discussion. Let me start where Dr. Obi has left, because she has mentioned extremely important points. Before I talk about the multilateral system, she talked about the importance of understanding partnerships as a currency, building coalitions, inclusion, and addressing aspects of poverty like the learning poverty. Extremely important messages from her, and these are at the heart of should be at the heart of the new way of looking at the multilateral system. And talking about that as a framework of reform, as you know, the Secretary General has recently, earlier this year, launched the UN 80 initiative with the objective that now the UN has turned 80 years old, that this is a reform effort to make the United Nations system more fit for purpose in a world of complex crisis, of widening inequalities, as was mentioned by the eminent speakers, but also the eroding trust. And this reform initiative is also, an initiative that will restore confidence in the multilateral system as a force for inclusion, solidarity, but also impactful results. This initiative, of course, has three work streams which address efficiencies, which address also reviewing mandates, but also the structural reforms and the programmatic realignment to suit also the needs and the complexities of our current world. And at the heart of all of this, and going back to also what Dr. Obi was mentioning, lies what we call South-South and Triangle cooperation, which I have the privilege of leading the office that is mandated by the UN General Assembly to advocate, to promote, and to support South-South cooperations. And I think these modalities, they do, embody the very principles of what this UN 80 seeks to institutionalize. So efficiency through collaboration, but also accountability through ownership. And also, there is a need also, as Dr. Obi was saying, there is a need for better ownership of development. And of course, effectiveness through innovation. This is a modality that can move us to a much more networked multilateralism, but also where developing countries can exchange knowledge, can design policies, and can deliver solutions that go beyond the geographic boundaries. We are, as we speak, Belém, the COP30 is happening. We all know the climate crisis is a crisis that go beyond geographic boundaries and require a lot of cooperation among countries to be able to address adaptation, to be able to address mitigation, to be able to also move into sustainable energy transitions. Equally also important to this discussion is the financial architecture reform and the inclusion. As we move forward, the inclusion of all countries is important in this reform. We, from our side, are believers that digital transformation is a key leapfrogging mechanism for all of this. And with South-South and cooperation at the heart of this reform, I think it is definitely a promising avenue to bridge and accelerate the SDGs.
Thank you, Dima. I mean, Gita, if I may come to you, one of the criticisms, of course, is that there is too much vagueness in the SDGs, and there needs to be more sort of direct and, if you like, more precise, perhaps, policy prescription in them. Building on what Dima said, in terms of how the multilateral institutions could better pick up facing all the challenges that they do. What's your view on this issue of how they can play a better and more effective role? Gita.
I don't think it's going to be easy under the current circumstances. I mean, when I was still in the government quite a while ago. We were still at the tail end of the heydays of multilateralism, right? And ever since then, as I alluded to earlier, the inequalities have not helped in bringing people together within a country, much less amongst countries. Now, for a multilateral organization to work, and I can speak for Southeast Asia, which is where I'm from, I think it's important to understand the limits or the structural limitations of Southeast Asia. If you skip over Singapore, 80 to 90% of the households are headed up by somebody without a university education. Case in point, Indonesia, 88%, and then 93% of the electorate, they do not have a university education. So we have to go with the presumption that most people in Southeast Asia, expand that to the global South, do not have a proper understanding of the challenges that we're facing today as they relate to not just climate change, but geopolitics, economics, and technology, right? Now, I think the best way for countries in Southeast Asia to deal with the current global challenges and how they can actually help in multilateralizing in a much more robust manner so that the multilateral institutions can be much more effective is to actually try to remedy those percentages from 88 to 0 as quickly as possible, and then 93% to 0 as quickly as possible. Without that, I think the narrative of sustainability as being ushered by the multilateral institution is not going to have the kind of realism that it needs. It has been a little too aspirational, if not ideological. It doesn't have the necessary dosage of realism. And I talked a little bit about the realism that's needed within the narrative of sustainable or sustainability in the context of where the renewable energy can be procured and where the purchasing power of most of the developing world is, which is, from electrification standpoint, we're looking at about 5 cents, which is where most people in the developing world can afford on a kilowatt basis. Whereas if you take a look at all these available, alternative energies, they're there technologically, but they're procured only at a cost of 15 cents or more. Now, the multilateral institutions, I think, can help figure out, bridge between these 2 points that are not reconcilable as of today. Somebody's got to take a view in terms of when the two are likely to intersect and how they're going to intersect even faster. Without the help of a multilateral institution and taking that view, I think it's going to get very difficult at the rate that we're not moving that needle from 88% down to 0 as quickly as possible, 93% to 0 as quickly possible. So at the rate that we're not educating people so that there is a better intersection between power and talent, you lose sight of the necessary governance, you lose sight of the necessary quality of leadership. At the rate that we're not educating enough of the masses as to learn how to translate uncertainties to risk better, we're not going to be able to get the kind of capital allocation the way we want to. And that, unfortunately, is just going to be unfortunate to the role of multilateral institutions going forward.
Thank you, Gita. Looking ahead at the challenges that we face, Dima, you mentioned something that really caught my attention, which is the increasing need to sort of look at networked solutions or networked strategies rather than sort of relying on the pillars approach, which I think has been hitherto the way we've looked at things, and these networks, of course, are shifting. I mean, we can talk about it in the context of the global South. We can talk about it in the context of relationships between the different regions of the world that are largely being driven now by trade corridors, by connectivity. And so I'm very interested to hear from you in terms of the challenges that we now face for the future in terms of maintaining sustainable development as a priority, how you feel these sort of innovative ways or as you put it earlier, but these new ways of looking at how the world is connecting can help. Dima.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, this is a compounded question, right? It definitely requires much more time to dwell on every aspect. But let me focus on a few elements. First, I mean, this is a proven approach. I mean, we have seen how when countries coalesce together or come together around certain issues, the impact is much better and much higher and well invested. I think I don't want to call it a shift in narrative, but I think as we move forward with the traditional thinking of support to sustainable development and the traditional way of rather vertical support needs to be moving forward balanced by countries coming together, whether around thematic areas of collaboration or whether cross-regional. We have seen also that, with several initiatives such as the ASEAN, the CELAC, in the case of Africa, the trade agreement that brings African countries together. All of this have brought much more effective results when it comes to, lasting sustainable development. But I do also agree with the previous speakers, the investment in education, the investment in social protection, the investment in issues such as climate security. These are also foundationals and also needs much more proactive action by the countries, whether individually or collectively. Otherwise, it would be a one-off, right? And this is why frameworks such as the Buenos Aires Action Plan for South-South Cooperation, or such as the Pact of the Future, and I think also all the global agendas for the past 2 years have been calling for countries to come together around these thematics, whether it's the least developed countries agenda, whether it's the landlocked countries agenda, whether it's the small islands developing states agenda, whether it's the middle income countries agenda, not to mention also the recent Sevilla framework that was recently approved at the Financing for Development. So all of these frameworks, they do call for that now the challenge is to put this into action. And to put this into action, there is a big role for the multilateral system because it provides also neutral grounds and equal grounds to bring countries on common footing together, and hence the centrality of South-South and Triangle cooperation and all of that. Now, on the specifics, and when it comes to the SDGs, we also need to think about the measurements of the SDGs and the flows of support, not only in terms of north to south, but also south to south cooperation, and how can we enhance new development partners to be part of this overall equation, whether it's the private sector or the philanthropies or even the multilateral development banks. There is a huge role that they can play. We need to provide the space. We need to bring them on. But also we need to think about the key powerhouse in the countries of the South, which are the youth, in terms of investing in youth, giving them the space to be engaged and giving them the space to also be part of this overall new development era moving forward.
Thank you, Dima. And Dr. Obi, how do you see how to address the challenges ahead?
Dima, thank you so very much for the points that you just articulated. We're very much in sync on a number of them. How do I see the road ahead? Michael, what are you doing? Giving me the power of clairvoyancy or something like that. I think, I will then.
It can be a short road,
I know. I would answer this question by telling you that if we framed the mood that we should be in by virtue of what has happened in our world in the past, we should know that we are in a moment of opportunity to move ourselves to a new order, a new level. And it's usually a very painful period, but it is the period of birthing. It is a period of birthing, a birthing of new ideas, a birthing of new solutions, a birthing of new ways of getting things done. And so I would say that the road ahead is one where asking questions and asking the right kinds of questions would lead us in a direction that is good. And the asking questions from the perspective of what evidence tells us. I think that a lot of what is going on in our world today is also because we're not being faithful to what evidence tells us about the things that we want to do or the things that we want to embrace as new ideas. So evidence-based kind of approach, especially on the part of citizens. Citizens need to pay more attention to what worked in the past. Why did it work? Or what did not work? Why did it not work? And what would the future that we want to see look like? And so that's my number one. My number two is that at the heart of the near collapse of ways of getting things done in our world is actually the erosion of values. If you look at all the democracies, what's ailing the democracies is the erosion of values. What are the values that we all share today? What values are our institutions anchored on? What values drive our political class in our respective countries? This erosion of what could be our universal values is a very big dent on where we're going in the future. So we do need to sort of, as citizens, begin to frame a set of values on the basis of which any multilateral order that would work for all could stand. Do we have it as people who are not private sector, not government, but citizens? Citizens just wanting a more decent world. What values do you, from across the various regions that are represented in the global town hall meeting, what values bring all of us together? If we framed it, then it can be a guardrail for the formal systems and the conversations necessary. And
Thank
just
you.
two more minutes, and I'll just
1 minute, please, Dr. Obi.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, Michael. I know you're pressed for time. I think that we have to understand that in the case of my continent, my optimism lies in three game changers: the young people, the women, and technology. The young people, women, and technology. These three game changers will propel the continent. And that propelling will come from the sense that there are no alternatives other than to take full responsibility for what the world looks like and to design it from the kind of ideals that are.
Excellent point, Dr. Obi, on women and youth. And Gita, just to round out this session among the speakers, how do you see the challenges ahead? And very quickly, please, because we are a bit short of time.
Well, I'm one of many in Southeast Asia who think that for Southeast Asia, China is increasingly becoming a technological capital allocator. And we are seeing the West increasingly as a natural economic capital allocator. Technological capital and economic capital are needed for SDGs, for the fulfillment of SDGs. As much as this technological capital and this economic capital would have to be democratized to Southeast Asia, I think there's a limit as to the extent to which both kinds of capital are likely to be democratized. And the limits are driven by the lack of tertiary and non-tertiary education of the populace, with the exception of Singapore. And this, I think, correlates with the inability or the difficulty to find the right optimal point of intersection between power and talent at the governance and at the leadership level. This is, I think, structural. This will stay on for quite a while. The second is what I alluded to earlier, is the lack of translational capability. This is where I think multilateral institutions could help accelerate in terms of being translational so that there is more capital allocation. But I do believe that at a much more structural level is really relooking at ASEAN differently going forward as a regional organization with less principle of subsidiarity. The principle of non-interference, I think, is going to be it's going to cause more challenges to Southeast Asia. To the extent that ASEAN does not interfere, particularly with respect to reducing the educational attainment divergence, I think Southeast Asia is going to be even more exposed to global challenges as they relate to geopolitics, economics, climate change, and technology. At the rate that some countries are earning $2,000 per capita per year, whereas Singapore is earning $91,000 per capita per year, that divergence is going to further widen at the rate that we're not remedying the pre-existing educational attainment divergence. So I think some degree of supranationalism within ASEAN to copycat the pre-existing best practice of education in Singapore for all the other members will help accelerate in our dealing with the pre-existing challenges.
Thank you, Bagita. And, this discussion, I think, has brought out a couple of very interesting points. And we're going to move now to the broader discussion with discussants. But I very much like your point, Gita, because I think it reminds me that, I come full circle. I mean, 40 years ago, when I moved to Southeast Asia, some of these development issues were front and center. And then there was a sort of period of prosperity where we kind of neglected them. And now, of course, it's come back front and center. And I think you're right to point out the role of supranationalism. And Dr. Obi, your point about youth and citizen involvement is very, very important. And Dima, thank you so much for that sort of clear presentation on the role of the multilateral system. As we move now to the discussants, we have about half an hour, maybe a bit less. So I would like to just go in the order it's been presented to me. And that starts at the moment with Professor Indrajit Roy. Would you like to comment on the discussion we've just had? You've got 3 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to everyone for their excellent presentations. As somebody who's looked at the changing architecture of development, it's quite fascinating to be here and to listen to everyone talk about the issues that face us. I think all of you've touched on an issue that's very close to my own research, which has to do with the connected politics of sustainable development. How can connections be built across the North and the South? And also to evaluate the troubles that development finance from the global North is in. I think there is very much the phenomenon of elite revolt, as it were, that's going on, where the richest people in the world are refusing to stand by others. But I think there is a lot in there that points to the emergence of what some of us, especially working on Southeast Asia, have called a multiplex world order, where it's not just great power competition that we are seeing, but also the opportunities that emerge for multiple other actors, including regional bodies, including non-governmental actors, to actually make a difference. So I thought there was a lot in there that spoke to issues of global concern. 3 questions to anyone in the panel who would sort of really like to take them up. One is there is the question of reorganizing of global governance that all of you touched on. And I wondered if there is any thinking around how the very heart of the United Nations, that is the Security Council, may in some ways be demilitarized. I think the point was made how the biggest spenders of military aid are sort of, in positions of power. Is there a way in which those who prioritize sustainable development might actually be, incorporated within the seat of power, and the power itself is redefined and reorganized in terms of sustainable development rather than military might? So that's one. The second is I was really fascinated with the discussion around the role of regional bodies, as well as the new multilateral groupings. And I think when we talk about the global south, we've come to recognize that there is no one global south anymore. You could think about a power south and a poor south within the broader framing of the global south. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, is there something that the powers, do you see the power south, the BRICS, the expanded BRICS, etc., taking on the sort of responsibility that used to be assumed for, the richer countries of the global north? And thirdly, I think some of you pointed to the fact of inequalities, and I think that's absolutely right. Inequalities between countries, but also inequalities within countries. Is there something that can be done to reach out to publics in the global north, those who've suffered from inequality in the global north, in order to renew bonds of solidarity between publics in the global north and others in the global south, so that we can really have a cross-border solidarity between the north and the south in the truest sense of the term? I think I'll stop there, but thank you again for this excellent set of presentations.
Thank you, Indrajit. I actually want to know and now hear from Dima on this specific question on I know it's a very big topic in itself, the reform, if you like, of the UN structure to better reflect, what's actually happening in the world. But Dima, just very quickly, do you want to respond to Indrajit's point there about reform of the Security Council, and also how to make it more focused on development issues?
Thank you very much, Indrajit. These are also very important questions. I mean, the Security Council is definitely, there is a call for the reform of the Security Council. This is something that has to be led by the member states. And we all know that it is also a non-inclusive platform. When it was established, its governance did not include a lot of countries that were at the time, still colonized. So there is a huge need to do that, and I think it's the countries, it's the member states who needs to keep pushing for that. But that is definitely a key important body that will enable, the progress further towards sustainable development versus, addressing only the political issues. So, in my opinion, this is a must. There has been several attempts to push for that, but we all know that it is also about geopolitical dynamics and political agendas, unfortunately. But also Indrajit raised an important point about the frameworks to enable further discussions or connection between the public of the global north and the global south. And I think this is very important, and it brings me back on the there should be more enhanced platforms for these discussions, such as this platform, but also to think about triangular cooperation. And this is a concept that is very much based on also solidarity and equality, which build bridges between the North and the South, not only in terms of financing, but also in terms of dialogues, in terms of sharing experiences, and in terms of addressing key development issues.
Thank you, Dima. Next on the list of discussants to pose questions to the speakers is Sarah El-Sheikh. Sarah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Given our time constraints, I'll just ask a direct question. There's a lot of focus on the 4 trillion financing gap, but what if the money isn't the bottleneck? Even when funding has existed, there has been issues with corruption and bureaucratic delays and projects that never reach the people they're meant to help. So my question is, if the 4 trillion were available tomorrow, do the systems exist to deploy effectively?
Thank you, Sarah. And next, if I can take another question. So it's on the spending. That's a very good question. But if I could then go to Sheikha Al-Shaibi.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much for for the valuable contribution. And I just want to note before I put down my question, on the importance of local inclusion, as Dr. Obe had suggested, especially when it comes to women and youth and building, different modalities and different innovative financing modalities, even for, regions such as Africa, etc. So just to keep it short here, my question is to you, Dr. Obe. So like you emphasized the importance of local priorities and citizen-driven development. And my question is really, how can like financing systems be redesigned so that investment in technology actually reaches women at the community level? So not just like as a downstream benefit, but as a direct financing that supports women led digital solutions and innovation in fragile and underprivileged communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheikha. Actually, Dr. Obi, I'll come to you first to answer that question, and then I would like to ask Gita to answer the question on spending. So first, Dr. Obi, to you to answer the question from Sheikha.
Yes. So, Cheka, it turns out that what has gone furthest in terms of the transformation of that we're seeing of the economies in Africa is actually fintech. Fintech is being led by the young people, which is part of the evidence that I have behind me in advocating for much more attention to these three game changers. And when you come at the intersection between young and women, you find that it is really quite strong. And so to the extent that we're using more in terms of the capabilities of technology, reaching the women as a basis for connecting them to the financing that they need to power their own entrepreneurial exploits. We are moving in the direction of giving them the power and the agency they need. So it's a bundled product through the innovative financing things that we see through fintech on the continent. As a matter of fact, probably more than 50% of companies that have attained unicorn status come out of fintech. And a lot of the fintech solutions are going to women in entrepreneurship. But the second part is the role of regional development banks. The role of regional development banks. I think they are so poorly capitalized, and now we do need to think of how the whole agenda for development, especially if it is led by the BRICS, expanded BRICS, it's really saying a different model has to be. So development takes the role that security is playing. If we don't get development, we have fragility in the world, and we need to make that point consistently.
Thank you, Dr. Obi. Gita, can you just very quickly address Sarah's question before we go to the next discussion?
Sure. I mean, that question is so apt for places, in many places in Southeast Asia, where accountability is not where it's supposed to be for money that's already been deployed. But it kind of dovetails back to what I alluded to earlier. I think the structural limitation in terms of the degree to which capital, whether it's technological or economic, gets democratized depends on the degree to which there is rule of law, the degree to which we have translational capabilities. To the extent we don't have proper translational capabilities, to the extent we don't have proper rule of law, we get caught up in so much lack of accountability for stuff that's been spent. And it gets worse for stuff that needs to be spent, but it's not there. So I tell my Southeast Asian colleagues, of course, with the exception of Singaporeans, at the rate that 80 to 90% of the households are headed up by somebody with a tertiary education, stop complaining about the quality of politicians, because they don't come from planet Mars. They come from ourselves. So we've just got to work on reducing that percentage to zero as quickly as possible so that we can remedy the pre-existing problems as they relate to accountability or lack thereof.
Thank you, Geeta. Now, next I would like to turn to Tariq Hassan. Tariq, floor is yours. 3 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation and for the great informations. Well, I actually agree with all of you, with all of your points. And actually, I have specific questions regarding the conflicted, areas. They are facing a huge of issues, and they are really behind in terms of the progress of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and also how can the governments and the private sectors and civil society can collaborate to secure like a predictable financing so that a single donor decision does not derail interest sectors, and how can we protect the data systems, because without data we cannot track progress, target interventions, or hold ourselves accountable, and also how do we ensure that SDGs is actually remain central to global corporations and not to the afterthought, despite raising geopolitical tensions among some of the countries. I think these certain of questions need to be understood to not leave no one behind on this sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. And next, Vishnavi Charlotte.
Hello, Selamat Jatter from Malaysia. I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. Let me go straight into my question. Several ASEAN countries continue to face governance fragility, internal conflict, or political transition that make SDGs implementation extremely difficult. At the same time, development assistance from more advanced economies, including major global donors, has become increasingly unpredictable, politically conditioned, or deprioritized altogether. Even relatively stable countries like Malaysia, for example, are feeling the effects of shifting development dynamics, facing tighter fiscal space, rising social inequalities, and also the need to balance domestic reforms with regional solidarity. Given these challenges, what forms of governance, cooperation, or regional accountability can ensure that the countries most in need, especially those dealing with civil conflict, fragile institutions, or political instability, receive sustained, fit-for-context SDG support rather than being left vulnerable to donor fatigue or geopolitical withdrawals?
Thank you. Can I, actually, that's a very direct question. And before we go to our last discussant, Tariq, maybe does anyone of the speakers want to jump in on that very, very specific question on governance? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to take the second question, but let the others first.
Yeah, Dima, I wanted to ask you perhaps to address that issue of governance.
Yes, a very important question. The governance elements are extremely important. They are the foundation to also address the issues I think raised by Sarah in terms of fighting or mitigating corruption, right? And this is where also the citizenship is extremely important. The ownership of development is important. The inclusion is very important. And I think also Geeta has mentioned it's also upon the citizens to also be much more aware about, who is governing us at the level of the countries. So there is a multiple-pronged approach to address corruption, to address enhancing governance at the level, not only at the level of the countries, but also at the regional level, the reprioritization, the engagement, and the inclusion. Now, also in terms of the SDGs support, and I think it was also mentioned earlier by the speakers, by Obi, and I also mentioned that there is also a role in terms of this limited fiscal space, the need to engage additional partners, the multilateral development banks, even the national banks, even the private sector. We need to start perceiving them also as partners in development and engaging them in that process. So inclusion, giving space for addressing the voice of the citizens, targeting the most needy population groups, engagement of youth, targeting women, but also systems of accountability, which needs to be implemented at every level.
A question that was raised earlier, which I found really interesting, was this idea of, linking up the voices of citizens in the global north and the global south. We often tend to see these things in terms of separate groups of issues and separate cultures, if you like, of citizen participation and awareness. And yet it's a fair point that if things don't link up globally, then the citizens themselves are going to find that their voices are compartmentalized and put into the context of where they're from, rather than addressing global challenges. Dr. Obi, you've talked a lot about citizen involvement, but how do you see that question of how to link, if you like, the continent and its voices with those in other parts of the world?
So, Michael, it turns out that the citizens are actually already finding themselves. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, the citizens are already actually finding themselves. I recently, was at the Euro Forum IPAC in Austria, I think some 3 or 2 years ago. And one thing that was very clear is that there are project teams involving young people from out of Africa, women from out of Africa, and European countries. But what is holding back things from being achieved at scale is the absolute lack of readiness of formal systems to realign into the ways that young people solve their problems today. So one thing that I found works in getting people to rethink is when I give them the average age of the world's population. India is the closest to Africa at 28.4. But Latin America is 31.3. Asia is 32.2. US is 38.5. China is 39.6. Europe is 44.5. Africa is 18.8. If you're going to think of how you even self-preserve into the future in the countries of the North, you cannot be thinking of your domestic issues and building walls to closing yourself. So there is a sense in which when we use data, we're able to get people to think about the future slightly differently. I've seen that happen with policymakers. And so it's important that the kind of the global town hall that we're having would be one that brings in coalition of the willing amongst citizens and policy think tanks across the different geopolitical zones, because then we can think of the world that we share from an entirely different perspective of the global public goods and the global public bads that no one single nation can solve on its own.
Thank you, Dr. Obi. Thank you for reminding me my age. Discussant, the last discussant to pose questions will be Tarek Kapazoglu. Tarek, go ahead.
Thanks. First of all, I would like to thank the Foreign Policy Committee of Indonesia for organizing. In relation to all these topics, the key point I would like to underline is this. Today, our world faces problems that cannot be solved by a single country alone, but rather require many countries to come together solve. So main question, if international politics and organizations such as the United Nations are unable to resolve global instabilities, how can it realistically achieve the sustainable development goals? We are facing 3 major problems, I think, in the international system. First, since 2024, the state of Israel has been carrying out a genocide in Palestine before the eyes of all humanity. International organizations have failed to impose any practical deterrent sanctions on Israel. And second, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency's 2025 data, there are currently 42 million refugees in the world. This situation is making extreme nationalist movements increasingly popular in many countries, and this is a problem. And last third, security threats in international energy corridors and political developments that restrict global foreign trade impose a serious problem on countries' production volume and supply chain. There is no international organizations that produces a final solution in this regard either. So I think we must recognize that the United Nations and other international organizations have become an institution that can no longer adequately respond to the needs of our time. It's not realistic to expect an organization that fails to address such fundamental problems to reliably lead the world towards achieving its own development goals. So that's enough, I think.
Thank you, Tariq. Right at the end here, you've raised the, or you've pointed at the huge elephant in the room with regards to what we've been talking about, which is the prevalence of much more serious crises with all their dimensions of humanitarian, of humanitarian needs, of violence, and of impunity that actually does really show up, as you say, the shortcomings and the flaws in the current multilateral system. So I'm afraid, Dima, I'm going to have to put this question to you. And it's a very difficult one, I know, because we've been talking about development. But in fact, I mean, the prevalence of these very serious global crises, as pointed out by Tariq, does, I think, in the eyes of many people, undermine, if those things can't be resolved, if international law has no currency in those situations, how on earth can we be talking about addressing global issues of development?
Yes, thank you. And I do understand, the frustrations, and I do also feel with what Tariq was saying in terms of the compounding crisis that have been happening across. We have to differentiate again here between the role of the Security Council and the role of the humanitarian organizations. The humanitarian organizations, the multilateral system have also been paying the price in a lot of crisis countries. Lots of casualties, lots of victims, lots of people being abducted. The reform of the whole multilateral system, and including, the subsidiary bodies, including the Security Council, is also an act that has to be pushed by the member state. It's not only about the United Nations system. The United Nations system role is to provide the technical expertise, is to provide the humanitarian support, is to try to mobilize resources. But a lot of the problems that the world is facing that are political, it's not only about technical and the role of the multilateral system. So the accountability has to be, across every actor. So this is my reaction. Now, in terms of trade and trade corridors, I think UNCTAD has been trying to work hard with all the countries to try to do the trade assessments, to provide technical support. I don't think that the UN system lacks the technical capacities in terms of support to the countries and what they need to provide. I think also with this UN reform, it's trying to bring the UN system more together for a better fit for purpose with limitation of the overlapping mandate, but the purpose is to provide a better service for the countries. And I think we need to keep reminding ourselves about the importance of the presence of the multilateral system in order to support countries. But this is also a call for action across the countries to also assert themselves in terms of what do they want to achieve, how do they want to be governed, and what role they want to play.
Thank you, Dima. Dr. Obi, I mean, I think Tariq's question really does require us to answer that point about what is the use of everything, all these frameworks and networks for development. If we can't address the huge stress in the humanitarian system and stop the impunity with these conflicts. Dr. Obi, just very quickly, we've got about 2 minutes or so, please, and then I'll finally come to Gita to wrap us up and then end the session.
I think that that question takes us to the point that Gita was making, which is the frustration that we sort of are hemmed in by a larger majority of citizens who, frankly, do not have the kind of knowledge of the situation that we face. And yet we have, on the other hand, a bunch of people who have the levers of power, but are not exercising them rightly. So what do you do to close that to address this incongruity? I think it falls back to the necessity for global town halls like this to now really realize that leadership has to be taken, and responsibility would be taken only by citizens, because the other sectors, whether it's the private sector, it's the political sector, as in the governance systems, have no incentive to change the current status quo, as we've seen. And so even for us that are interested in matters like this, we do need to be more sophisticated in the way that we're finding the tools to unlock the citizens' agency. I think that when we think of citizens, we should not allocate and actually endorse this feeling of learned helplessness. Even the uneducated should be able to know when issues are contrary to their own good, and we haven't engaged. We will run the risk ourselves on this panel, or ourselves in these rooms, run the risk of repeating the behavior of the private sector and the public sector by being a select elite that are talking about these matters. We do need to unlock the power of citizens.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very quickly, a couple of words, Gita, before I close.
Well, I think the impunity that you're alluding to is manifested in how certain countries are showing this great degree of conviction as if they can write or rewrite history. And that doesn't resonate well to a lot of people, right? Lastly, I just want to say that I think if there's one point to be recognized from this session is that the multilateral institutions don't have the kind of money needed for SDGs, but they can certainly be translational, right? Now, the money is in the private sector, but the private sector will only deploy money if it attains profitability. At the moment, the narrative of sustainability is not a profitable one. So somebody's got to take a view. So it requires one or two regional or multilateral organizations to be the translators. ASEAN, I think, could be the translator as in the context of helping de-risk and translating from uncertainties to risks. At the rate that most countries in Southeast Asia have very limited fiscal space, tax ratios of 10 to 16% only, and very limited monetary space, as reflected in less than 100% monetary supply to GDP ratios. So the role of multilateral institutions is still well needed. But in addition to that, I think we're going to need the role of ASEAN with some degree of supranationalism in helping further de-risk and further translate from uncertainties to risk so that there's more capital deployment.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhagita. And thank you all for a wonderful discussion. I very much enjoyed it. And thank you to our speakers and to our discussants. I know these online platforms can often be quite difficult to follow. I hope everyone managed to follow. And I think we've had a very interesting discussion. And now I will hand back to the organizers. And I just want to say thank you to everyone. And I wish you a very good evening, good afternoon.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to everyone who participated in the session titled SOS World Leaders, Can We Refocus, Realign, and Reprioritize World Affairs for Sustainable Development? Coming up next, we have the first special session featuring discussants from our CSO partners worldwide titled Listen to Us, Messages for G20 Leaders from Civil Societies Around the World. The special session will begin in just a few minutes. Please stay tuned.